Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and this is the first of a few recorded lectures for the 1970s. And so I'm going to break this up into several kind of smaller topics, and kind of maybe shorten some of the videos so that way you're not listening to like a 45-minute lecture total. But anyway, the first one is going to be about Nixon's domestic policy. So his time in office, what's happening. Lead to his policy at home, and then the next one will be Nixon's foreign policy, and then I usually save a lecture for Watergate because students are really fascinated by that, and so forth. So when Nixon wins the 1968 presidential election, he makes a big presidential comeback. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture on 1968 particularly, Hubert Humphrey had won the Democratic nomination despite all the turmoil at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. And Nixon wins, and George C. Wallace runs kind of like as this Southern states' rights advocate and takes some popular votes away from Hubert Humphrey. And Nixon, in particular, hurts Hubert Humphrey in trying to win the South. And so as a result of that, Nixon, with his Southern strategy, actually wins the election of 1968. Now, Nixon, when he enters the presidency, he's going to enter the office with a Democrat-controlled Congress. Nixon is an interesting guy. He was once, at one point, made a list of all of his enemies, and later the guy who replaced him, Gerald Ford, was told about that, and he's like, man, a guy who makes a list of all of his enemies has got too many enemies. But Nixon kind of was more of an introvert and kind of had a remote personality, but he definitely was well experienced. He had been a congressman right after World War II and fought against communist spies such as Alger Hiss. They worked for the federal government. He also was vice president under Eisenhower during the Cold War of the 1950s. And then after losing to JFK barely in 1960, ends up becoming governor of California, and then becomes president when he gets inaugurated in 1969. So Nixon ran on a kind of political platform of small government that he called New Federalism. He wanted to give more power into the hands of the people, and he started a revenue sharing program, where a portion of federal tax revenues would be given back to the states. Okay. So that's kind of interesting. That never really happened before, where you had a portion of federal tax revenues given back to the states. Now, FDR kind of did that with some of the New Deal programs, but it was a little bit different and a little bit different circumstances. Nixon also scaled back government programs that had grown dramatically during the Johnson administration. The kind of federal spending got out of hand, both with Vietnam and with the Great Society. The War on Poverty programs were reduced, and the Office of Economic Opportunity entirely dismantled in 1971. Nixon even refused to spend billions of dollars appropriated by Congress for urban renewal, pollution control, and other environmental initiatives, and vetoed a 1971 bill to establish a comprehensive national child care system. And the reason why he vetoed the national child care system, he said it would lead to communal approaches to child rearing and endanger the American family. The reason why he does this is China's great leap forward under Mao Zedong had happened in the kind of the late 50s, early 60s, and they tried the communal nurseries, and it was devastating to the Chinese family, to the point where eventually the Chinese government has to get rid of it and go back to the children being raised by its actual biological parents. And Nixon feared that a nationwide kind of daycare system might end up being something like that, and so forth. Also, influenced by White House advisor Daniel Moynihan, who was a Democrat, Nixon proposed in 1969 a family assistance plan, which would guarantee a family of four an income of about $1,600 a year plus $600 in food stamps. So even though he vetoed this national daycare system, he did allocate money to provide for the poorest American families. By doing this, it would eliminate multiple layers of bureaucracy and pare down the nation's jerry-built welfare system to kind of make it simple. All right, if you're a poor family, you get $600 a year plus $600 in food stamps. Okay, now, obviously money could go a lot further back then than it does today because of inflation. Although Nixon proposes this, it was shot down in both houses of Congress. his proposal for national health insurance was also shot down. Now, it's crazy to think that Nixon actually favored national health insurance, but he actually did, and he favored smaller government, which is kind of ironic. Truman was the first president to propose a national health insurance, and Nixon proposed it as well. So you had a Democrat and Republican that did that. Also, Nixon approved generous advances in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. He also approved increased appropriation for entitlements like food stamps and Medicaid, as well as aid to families with dependent children, which is called AFDC. And Nixon also implemented a new federal program called Supplemental Security Income, known as SSI. Okay. And so what is SSI? It gave generous benefits to the indigent, who were like older people, blind, and disabled. He also signed into legislation in 1972 that raised Social Security old age pensions and provided for automatic increases when the cost of living rose more than 3% in any year. And so Nixon did kind of, he's a complex president. He favored smaller government, yet he expanded federal government programs, and yet he shot down other federal government programs. And so Nixon's an interesting guy. He defunded some environmental initiatives, but yet in some ways is considered an environmental president because of his environmental initiatives by founding the Environmental Protection Agency, and also push for cleaner air and water and so forth. So, and also ironic that he favored smaller government. He also increased regulatory agencies. For instance, he created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the Consumer Product Safety Commission in 1972. So Nixon, he seems kind of divided between his conservative principles, yet he was dealing with a Democrat-controlled Congress. So Nixon, who was really a brilliant political strategist, is going to have to compromise with the Democratic-controlled Congress. Later in the 1990s, you'll see that Clinton, who was a Democratic president dealing with a Republican-controlled Congress, he's also going to have to compromise as well. And one thing that both Nixon and Clinton kind of get credit for is willing to compromise with the other party's controlled Congress. One of the things, though, that Nixon's going to be battling is the economy. But before I get to that, I want to go over some of his close advisors, because some of these names will make sense when we get to the Watergate topic. First off, he had H.R. Haldeman, who was was his chief of staff. John Ehrlichman was his chief domestic advisor, and then John Mitchell was his attorney general. And Mitchell was eventually, we'll talk about Mitchell a little bit later when we get to Watergate scandal. Now, the most famous of his close advisors was Henry Kissinger, who also won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping negotiate the end of the Vietnam War for the United States in January of 1973. He's also appeared on the cover of Time magazine like 8 times. I'm not exactly sure if it was 8 times, but it was quite a few. And Kissinger was somebody whose family had escaped the Holocaust of Europe and during World War II. And he became his national security advisor and later his Secretary of State. Okay, so let's look at the economy. The economy of the 1970s was not great. It's what economists call stagflation. You had a stagnant economy, which means our economy is not growing. And then we had rapid inflation. So here's the cause of that. Well, the tax cuts proposed by Kennedy and implemented by Johnson, and then the mass spending on the Great Society and the Vietnam War, they had printed so much paper money that led to this massive inflation of the 1970s. And Nixon tried to tackle this inflation by imposing a 90-day wage and price freeze in 1971. To stimulate the nation's staggering exports, he took the U.S. off the gold standard and ended up devaluing the dollar. And that's one of the things he does is kind of controversial by taking us off of the gold dollar or gold standard. Nixon firmly believed basically that you have to tackle inflation by trying to put this price cap and also taking us off the gold standard. And really, the economy of the 1970s is just kind of blah. One of the things that happened is Germany and Japan, their economy had brand spanking new factories thanks to United States helping them rebuild after World War II, and we had occupied them for a number of decades. And so the United States also kind of transitioned more from a blue collar economy to a white collar economy. And that also changed things as well. And so, um, kind of also with this white collar economy, you end up transitioning from more manufacturing jobs to service sector jobs. Well, a lot of these old school manufacturing jobs in our country pay better than a lot of the service industry jobs. And what I mean by service industry job, think about retail stores, restaurants, hotels, tourism. Those are service industry jobs. Somebody who is working at, say, Six Flags is not going to be making what somebody who'd be working in a steel mill would have been making at that time, and so forth. So you have the economy changing, and then also moving to more service industry jobs. Okay. Now, unemployment is going to rise. Also, federal spending proved difficult to control. And so Nixon turned to deficit spending, which had been done by previous administrations, and so forth. Another thing that's going to hurt the United States economically is the OPEC embargo. Now, I covered that in Nixon's foreign policy as well, but let me give you a kind of a brief aspect of it. What happened is there was a war in the Middle East where Egypt and Syria attacked Israel in 1973. And so the United States and the Netherlands sent emergency weapons and aid to Israel to help them fight against Egypt and Syria. Well, it saves Israel, and they're able to hold on against Egypt and Syria. And so the Saudi Arabia, which is the largest oil-producing country in the world at that time, and still this day, at least at the time of making this lecture, they were the leaders of what was called OPEC. It's an organization of petroleum exporting countries. It consists of several Middle Eastern countries, some North African countries, also Venezuela, Nigeria, and a couple of countries in Southeast Asia. So it's not just the Middle East, okay? So I don't want to make it think it's just a Middle East organization. But what they did is they cut off the selling of oil to the U.S. and Netherlands for supporting that. So the United States is going to have to get oil from its own oil reserves or U.S. drilling. That's one of the reasons why in the 1970s the United States started drilling in the Arctic Circle in Alaska and built the Alaska Pipeline as a result. But also other countries that weren't part of OPEC who exported oil. Well, the problem is that leads to gas price skyrocketing. In fact, it quadrupled. So let's say that gas right now, me making this lecture, is around $2.50-ish. Okay, so if it quadrupled in price, that would be $10 a gallon. Also, there was gas shortages. In fact, my parents remember waiting in gas lines for like over an hour at a gas station trying to get gas because of the OPEC embargo. And then eventually, they're not foolish. They know the United States is one of the biggest purchasers of oil internationally. And so when they started selling it to the United States again, they had jacked up the price. And so that made inflation even worse in the 1970s as a result of that. Okay. And so one of the things that Nixon does is, under his new federalism, he did favor smaller government, but he also doesn't want to lose political support. And so he kept and supported federal social programs. Even though he got rid of some, he kept others and increased funding, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, because he wants to keep those voters who had favored him in the 1968 election. Okay. And so one of the things that Nixon's Southern strategy did, I mentioned this briefly in the 1968 lecture, was that Nixon, even though he favored civil rights, he wants to keep his white Southern voters. So he doesn't like openly embrace it. And what he does, he actually kind of hinders it somewhat. So how he does this is, I'll give you an example. Okay, when I lived and taught in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, there was a school district that had different parts of the district. There was like 4 large high schools, and there was different ethnic groups live in different parts of the suburb, and it was a very diverse suburb. But what you end up having is, because of federal court orders, you had kids who were bused from a different part of the suburb to a different high school, even though they had a high school that was less than 5 minutes from where they lived, to another one across town, because of a federal court order in the 1970s to integrate their school. And so what ends up happening across the South, because of forced integration, you end up having whites created these private schools in a lot of these small towns and cities and towns across the South, particularly the Deep South, and especially in the Mississippi Delta. I remember playing against a town in East Arkansas called Helena, and Helena, they had a public school that was primarily all African American, basically. And then, but there were white people that lived in the town. Well, almost all the white people went to the local private school. And so that's an example of that. And it was even in the early 2000s when I played against them in sports. We played against the public school. We didn't play against the private school. But you have that. And so what Nixon did is he slowed the busing. He's like, look, we should still have integration, but let's not bus kids 30 minutes across town just for the sake of integration. And that's actually what some of these federal court orders had done. And so he slows busing, which led to him still getting Southern support in 1972 election. And so, but he doesn't stop integration. It doesn't stop the school busing. He just slows it down. And particularly it affects a lot of the Midwestern states. So it's not just the South, but a lot of Midwestern states had been ordered. They didn't have de jure segregation, which is segregation by law, but they had de facto segregation. Yes, segregation based on other factors. And so he had slowed the busing down, even affected Midwestern cities and towns as well. Nixon also was able to appoint 4 new Supreme Court justices. And this kind of gave him an opportunity to reshape the court. Now, normally you don't have 4 either retire or pass away during one president's time in office, but you actually did. And so Nixon appointed Warren Burger as the Chief Justice for the Supreme Court. He was a moderate. And then other appointees, representative, were more conservative judges and so forth. Also, Nixon had appointed 2 other nominees, but the Senate rejected them because they had showed racial bias as being Southerners from way back when. Another big event that really Kennedy should really gets credit for in American history, but happened during Nixon's first year in office, and that is the landing on the moon. In fact, they're making a movie about Neil Armstrong starring Ryan Gosling that just came out recently when I'm making this lecture. But he and Buzz Aldrin were able to the first people to walk on the moon with the Apollo 11 mission. And they received tremendous welcoming and hero status when they returned and so forth. You have Neil Armstrong on the left and Buzz Aldrin on the right. In fact, Buzz Aldrin was on Dancing with the Stars years ago, and he's deceased now. And then wouldn't you hate to be the guy in the top middle who had to be in the ship to allow the moon landing to redock and so forth. He never got to actually land on the moon, which had to be tough. These are actually pictures taken from the moon landing and so forth. Pretty cool. And next, you may be wondering, why does the flag look like it's flying? It's because it has wires in it to make it look like that. You know, Americans were flashy and like to show off. And this is the sorry, my text messages keep hitting in this video. This is actually the parade that kept happening or happened for the astronauts as they returned home and how popular they were and so forth. All right, we'll get to Nixon's foreign policy in the next topic.